As all eyes in Washington continue to stay on President Trump and his emerging cabinet and who he selected for the various positions, there's other audiences that are paying a great deal of attention to, and those are international actors, both friends and foes alike, trying to figure out where is Trump going to be going and how can different people leverage things to their advantage, or are they concerned about things that may be coming and what counteractions may they be taking in anticipation of what could be happening here. Lots of moving pieces here, a lot of complexity. Nothing is as simple as it seems on the surface. And to try and help us make sense out of all this, we have one of the masters at making sense out of complex things, Ambassador Chaz Freeman, back with the show today. Mr. Ambassador, welcome back.
Thanks. Glad to be back.
And listen, we're going to just give you a nice, easy one today, something that's easy to parse through and figure out what's going to happen here. I want to start off with the Middle East part and, some of what Trump may or may not be doing here, what he wants to do, what he will be able to do. And one of the interesting things, let's start, first of all, start off with what is going to be the relation between Trump and Netanyahu and Trump and Putin. I want to look at those two things today, and we're going to see if we can figure out how, who's going to come out on top, or, is it going to be a neutral kind of situation? So let's look first of all at Benjamin Netanyahu. And interestingly enough, he's kind of gotten into this habit here of late in the last number of months of giving speeches directed at the people of his opposition, people that he's at war with right now. And I want to ask first of all about the substance of, is there any utility in this? Is it going to work? Watch this one first.
Since we last spoke, the Khamenei regime launched hundreds of ballistic missiles at my country, Israel. I wonder, did he tell you how much that attack cost? Well, I'm not guessing. It's $2.3 billion. That's how much of your precious money they wasted on futile attacks. The missiles did marginal damage to Israel, but what damage did they do to you? That sum could have added billions to your transportation budget. It could have added billions to your education budget. But instead, Khamenei exposed the regime's brutality and turned the world against your country.
Now, first of all, I want to look specifically at his last phrase there, that his impression that the Ayatollah's actions have turned the world against Iran. I want to look at that separately. But first, just what do you make of his propensity to want to talk to the people of Iran or the people of Lebanon or the people in the Gaza Strip, et cetera, which he's done all of? Is there any utility in this?
Well, he has our number. He doesn't have theirs. In order to be persuasive, you have to have a degree of empathy for the people you're addressing. He has none. I think there will be jokes told in Iran, about how he reduced everything to a matter of money. That just plays into the stereotypes that people have of Israelis. And so I don't think that was persuasive at all. And certainly, far from turning the world against Iran, Iran now has more sympathy than ever. The rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran that began with Iraqi and then Omani and finally Chinese mediation or conciliation has developed. The chief of staff of the Saudi Armed Forces has just been in Tehran. There's a joint naval exercise in prospect. The Iranians joined a meeting in Riyadh, which was very, very strategically significant, and I don't think much understood outside the region. At that meeting, and the Arab League, the African Union, the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, this is the vast majority of the world's countries, all agreed that rather than just being passive resistance to Israeli genocide with American complicity in it, they will now take an active role. They will coordinate their efforts at the United Nations and elsewhere. And I think potentially this is extremely important because up to now, they have essentially been passive. They've been hedging. They've not been on the counterattack. And I think now they will be because things have just gone too far. Again, going back to Mr. Netanyahu, not mentioning what he's doing to the Palestinians as he speaks to the Iranians, deprives him of all credibility.
And I mean, let's just stick with that theme for a second, because I guess just in yesterday's news, the Chinese again came out and said that they are all about this rapprochement continuing on between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which had been, enemies or at least antagonists for quite some time before some recent developments had brought them closer into connection. We've also seen in the last, I think, 48 hours that Turkey has broken diplomatic relations with Israel, which hasn't gotten a lot of notice in the West. I guess everybody in the United States especially is all focused on Trump and everything else about the transition. This didn't make hardly a ripple. Should it have?
I think it should have. That is, the Turks are very much a factor, both in the in the meeting in Riyadh that I referred to, and they are leaders in the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, as well as members of NATO. Breaking with Israel is an action, not just a passive objection. And this may be the hallmark or the harbinger, if you will, of actions by others. China and the world generally, unlike Mr. Netanyahu, recall that the reason for the Iranian attack he referred to on Israel was retaliation for multiple Israeli provocations, mass murders, genocide, and assassinations. Going back to April, when Israel assassinated Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas, when he was a state guest in a state guest house at the presidential inauguration in Iran. So this is the background here, and it's what the world sees. They don't agree with Mr. Netanyahu at all. And in fact, we have just you mentioned the attention to Trump appointments. Elise Stefanik is to be our ambassador to the United Nations. I think if she behaves there the way she behaved in Congress, she's very likely to get mooned by her colleagues, not accepted. We are going to be with the Israelis, we're going to be the skunks at the garden party, and nobody's going to want to deal with us. So this is significant. An international alliance to push for a Palestinian state has been absent. The United States took charge of that issue and said to everybody, trust us, we'll get it done. We didn't. And now we're actually aiding genocide in Gaza and an attack in Lebanon. By the way, there seem to be claims from Israelis, the foreign minister, for example, that there's some sort of deal in the offing with Hezbollah. I don't believe that for a minute. I think this is yet another case of the United States and Israel talking to each other about how to reach a settlement with a third party and not involving that third party. And I don't think that third party, which is the government of Lebanon and Hezbollah, Lebanon is a very divided country, of course, but I don't think they're going to be on board with this idea that Hezbollah should pull out of the south of Lebanon and retreat north of the Litani River, and Israel should have a free hand there, so the settlers in the north of Israel can return to their homes in security. Instead, what is happening, and this again goes to the question of who's isolating whom, what seems to be happening is after the Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader in Iran, was basically pushed into, by public opinion in Iran and by pressure from his establishment, to declare that there would be a massive, painful retaliation against Israel's attack on Iran. That involves coordination with Hezbollah, with what's left of Hamas, with the Houthis in Yemen, with militias in Iraq. It is a counter widening of the war that Mr. Netanyahu has been trying to widen. And of course, his boasting about having destroyed Iranian air defenses is thought by most observers to be so much Israeli hot air, not a reality. And it remains to be seen if Israel could, in fact, cope with a massive Iranian attack on it. I mean, I believe that the previous experience demonstrates that it can't.
I'm going to show you a couple of clips coming up here where it's like saturated with irony in ways that I don't know that either of the speakers may have intended. But I want to look at one more clip from that same Netanyahu speech there to the Iranian people, and tell me what you think the reaction might be, not just in Iran, but maybe even some of the other countries in the region.
Close your eyes. Picture the faces of your children, beautiful, innocent souls. Think of the endless potential they would have. Their entire lives are ahead of them. Imagine how your children's lives would look if billions of dollars were invested in them instead of being wasted on wars that can't be won.
Because to me, when he says a war that can't be won, that's all this seven front that he's opened up. Militarily, there's no end state in any of these. He can't win any of them on the ground, certainly without Western help, but even with American help, I don't think that these things can be won. How is that viewed by other people when they hear him say a war that can't be won, when they're kind of looking at what he said?
Well, they're going to look at that clip and say, why is the greatest murderer of children in the modern age talking to us about the promise of our children? He has shown he has no regard for children, whether they are even Israeli hostages, still less Arab children. And of course, bravado has run up against realities now in southern Lebanon, where there are very high casualties among the Israelis. And as you know better than I, Danny, given your service in Afghanistan and Iraq, in modern warfare, wounds that would have killed people disable them for life. A lot of people don't die, but they have a burden for the rest of their lives. And that's what's happening to the Israeli forces in Lebanon. As far as I can tell, they've not been able to take and hold a single town, although they've blasted towns into rubble.
Yeah, and I guess I'm just wondering, what do the people around the region think when do they not look at him and say, talk about a war that can't be won, and these children, as you just mentioned there, might that ever translate into any action, as you said a second ago, or is this just something that's building?
I think it's built to the point that people are demanding action. And, even in authoritarian societies, there are processes of consultation. There is sensitivity to public opinion. And public opinion around the world, but particularly in West Asia and North Africa, has had it with Israel and had it with the West. They look at us and the roughly 14 countries who join us in support of Israel as some kind of axis of inhumanity. And they despise us in large measure because we are violating our own values, our proclaimed values. I mean, we spent a great effort after World War II to ensure that nothing like what the Nazis did or the Japanese in their rampages through Asia would ever be done again. And now we're sitting back and watching it being done, and we're denying that it's happening. So there's what the Chinese are doing, re-educating people and assimilating them forcibly in Xinjiang, not a good thing, is termed genocide. But the murder of a couple of 100,000 people and the wounding of another couple of 100,000 in Gaza is not genocide. No, this is a double standard that is so naked that it totally discredits us.
Yeah, and in fact, I'll go to irony part two here. One of the hopes that some may have had in the change of administrations coming in, you and I have often talked about, just the fecklessness of the current Secretary of State and the State Department, and then just the nature of our diplomacy anyway has basically been just subordinated to Israeli requirements. So the hope is, well, maybe the incoming team might be better. Well, Trump has selected now officially as his Foreign Secretary or Secretary of State designate Marco Rubio to come into this. And if anybody's wondering, well, what might he say on this? Here's what he said on an interview about a month ago.
Israel has killed Hezbollah, confirming its leader Hassan Nasrallah. Israel used a U.S.-made 2,000-pound bomb in the strike that killed him. You are vice chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee. How concerned are you that this could ultimately lead to a wider conflict between Israel and Iran, Senator?
Well, I think if Nasrallah was still alive, the threat of a broader conflict is even higher. This is a guy who cheerfully said, death to America, death to Israel. Now, when you're a country and someone runs an organization that exists for the specific and defined purpose of destroying you, you have no choice but to treat that person as an enemy and to confront them likewise.
You have no choice but to confront as an enemy anyone who's trying to kill you. Does he not see that that's being interpreted very different depending on which country you're
Yeah,
seeing?
well, of course, he doesn't see it, but he's also demonstrates a degree of ignorance that's quite appalling. Nasrallah was a very moderate leader in Hezbollah terms. He was a constant force for caution in their actions. He wasn't aiming at the United States or Israel. He wanted to avoid a war with Israel. He was supportive of Palestinian rights, yes, and he began a series of fairly limited skirmishes with northern Israel in support of Gaza and the Palestinians who were being murdered there. But to say that he's some kind of monster out to destroy the United States and Israel is complete nonsense. Lebanon has never invaded Israel, to my knowledge. Israel has invaded Lebanon on multiple occasions. Israel is killing civilians indiscriminately in Lebanon as we speak. Hezbollah, at least until this latest round, has been very, very careful to target only military facilities and intelligence facilities in Israel, by contrast with Israel. The notion that somehow or other Iran is a threat to the United States is absurd. It is a threat to Israel in large measure because Israel is a threat to it. Israeli policy aims explicitly at regime change in Iran. I don't think Iran is aiming at regime change in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. But even if it is, it has no capacity to do that. So this is a war of choice for Israel. That is the war with Hezbollah. It's justified by a desire, understandable desire, to return settlers to northern Israel. Latest poll of those settlers shows that about 2/3 of them don't plan to go back anyway because they feel insecure. Hezbollah is not a pushover. It's far more competent militarily than Hamas ever was, although Hamas surprised the world on October 7 with its breakout. Hezbollah is battle-hardened. They fought in Syria. They have a lot of experience fighting the Israelis. In fact, the origin of Hezbollah was defense against an Israeli invasion. So this notion that somehow this is some kind of intrinsically evil anti-Israeli organization that for no particular reason came into being is absurd.
Yeah.
If that's the sort of thing he brings to the office, he will confirm what the world has judged, that Mr. Trump is determined not to march in lockstep with Israel. Whatever Israel does, he will not exercise American power or leverage to curb its worst behavior or even to influence it. Mr. Netanyahu says he's had 3 telephone conversations with Mr. Trump since the election, and claims that he and Mr. Trump are exactly of one mind on Iran and other matters. So Mr. Rubio certainly falls, he's loyal to Mr. Trump's view, if that is Mr. Trump's view. I hope it is.
You mentioned the issue of the settlers, not settlers, but the residents of Israel moving back into the areas of their homes in the northern part. Rubio also spoke in that same interview on that topic. And what kind of jumps out to me, and I'd like your view on it, is if the Secretary of State is supposed to be the chief diplomat that's going to try to talk to all the countries in the region and saying, how can we resolve conflict at the lowest possible level, then you would have to take the needs and the viewpoints of both of the sides, especially we're talking about the Hezbollah, Lebanon, into account. But watch this clip here, because I don't hear a lot of concern about the north side of this border.
There are 60,000 Israelis right now who, for almost a year, almost a year now, have had to leave their homes in northern Israel and are living in hotels in Tel Aviv, and their kids are going to school online in conference rooms because the group that Nasrallah headed, which is Hezbollah, was using anti-tank weapons, not guided long-range missiles, anti-tank weapons to target them and civilian infrastructure, so people had to leave. What country can have 60,000 people permanently displaced? And that's what this issue with Hezbollah is all about. Israel wants a 6 to 10 mile buffer between itself and Hezbollah, so they can't be using these shoulder-fired rockets to target cities and civilian communities, so people can move back to their homes. And Hezbollah refuses to pull back. It continues with those attacks. And so Israel has no choice but to defend itself. And so wiping out not just Nasrallah, but the senior leadership of this evil organization, I think is a service to humanity.
A service to humanity. And one wonders, he's talking about the threat from Hezbollah to Israel, but it's Israeli Air Force and long-range missiles that are absolutely wiping out civilian infrastructure and cities, all in southern Lebanon there. And by his logic, you would have no choice but to fight back if that's what you're hitting. And again, I guess I ask you, what do other actors in the region think when they hear the future Secretary of State say these things?
Well, they will recall that if there are 60,000 Israelis living in hotels in Tel Aviv and their kids going to school online, there are 1.9 Palestinians in Gaza who've been forced to move many times, who have no homes, no education access for their kids, and who are being slaughtered. And they will also know that that is what is happening in Lebanon at the hands of the Israeli so-called Defense Force. So I think they will regard this as appalling. And if that is our line, we will have no takers in the region at all. And in fact, that is this sort of statement, which is so one-sided, blind, and cruel, is exactly why we apparently are beginning to see active pushback from the region as opposed to just passive resistance to our policies.
In speaking of the region, one of the things that Trump has been talking up about wanting to do in the Middle East is resurrecting the Abraham Accords and to continue on with all he started back then. And the linchpin was going to be Saudi Arabian normalization with Israel. Well, in a recent interview on CNN, or by CNN, actually it was in Riyadh, with the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia, poured a little cold water on that thought.
I would say that it is not just the issue of normalization with the kingdom that is at risk. I would say that the security of the region as a whole is at risk if we do not address the rights of the Palestinians, if we do not find our way to a pathway that leads us to a Palestinian state, because that's the only way we can ensure that we can focus on the future, that we can focus on cooperation, that we can focus on integration. So I would hope that the leadership of Israel sees that it is not just the right thing to do, it is not just the moral thing to do, it's not just the just thing to do to give the Palestinians their rights and their state. It is also in the security and strategic interest of Israel to do so.
So I guess got to say, it's just a bit of embarrassment to me and disappointment, disheartening to see the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia talking in a very measured and rational and logical issue that we're looking for diplomacy to try to find a way for all sides to come out of this on top. And then you see the U.S. designate new diplomat that's only talking about one way and just wanting to ignore everyone else. Just that's just troubling to me.
Well, we have become accustomed to a diplomacy-free foreign policy. Our diplomats have been enfeebled. The outgoing Secretary of State has a record of continuous failure at virtually everything he has attempted, in large measure because of this issue. He doesn't address the views or the perspectives of the other side. He goes out, he lectures, and in the case of West Asia, the Middle East, he's unabashedly pro-Zionist. This has no appeal. But what has happened as a result of this is not only the discrediting of the United States in the eyes of the countries of the region, Africa, and more broadly the Islamic world, but also a significant hardening of attitudes toward Israel. I think it's very significant that Bahrain, which is the headquarters of our Central Navy Command in the region, and which is very pro-American, is now talking about reestablishing relations with Iran. And as I mentioned earlier, we've basically pushed everybody in the region into the view that since we're not going to do anything constructive, they have to take the initiative. And that initiative will be to isolate and weaken Israel, and incidentally, to isolate and weaken us, because we support Israel without qualification.
You mentioned, I guess, continuing down that theme of disappointing potential diplomatic initiatives in the incoming administration. You talked about Elise Stefanik a minute ago, U.S. ambassador to the United Nations designate. Maybe one of the bigger, just cringeworthy picks was former Governor Huckabee going into the U.S. ambassador to Israel, because he's trying to distance himself a wee bit from this. But I'm going to show you a clip from 2017 that shows pretty much where his heart is.
I think Israel would only be acting on the property it already owns. I think Israel has title deed to Judea and Samaria. There are certain words I refuse to use. There is no such thing as a West Bank. It's Judea and Samaria. There's no such thing as a settlement. They're communities, they're neighborhoods, they're cities. There's no such thing as an occupation.
He further wanted to say there's no such thing as a Palestinian. That entity doesn't even exist. And when you have that entry, gracious, I mean, what is that going to do to advance any interest of the United States when you literally ignore? We're talking about, what is it, 7 million people total in the West Bank and Gaza that he just depersonalized or dehumanized.
Well, there are millions more outside Palestine who are refugees. They can't be ignored. As the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia said, addressing that problem, the problem of self-determination for the Palestinians, is the key to peace and security for Israel. Without that, Israel can never be secure and can never have the respect and friendship of its neighbors, still less the Palestinians. Now, Mr. Huckabee is completely a spokesman for the Zionist line. He is a Christian Zionist. The question we ought to ask is, whose interests is he going to be representing when he's resident in Jerusalem? And I don't think the answer is the United States. I think it is a religious conviction. By the way, the idea that somehow Israel owns the West Bank or Gaza or other things because of a religious belief that it owns it, is about like saying that the Lenni Lenape tribe should get Manhattan back because they lived there for thousands of years and the Dutch screwed them out of the place. This is just not serious. This is settler colonialism at its worst. It has zero support internationally. If we are in fact following that line, which I suspect we are, since Mr. Huckabee's predecessor, Ambassador Freeman, was very much of that opinion, I think we will have no support for that view at all. And you can judge that for yourself if you look at votes on this issue in the United Nations General Assembly, where we in Israel are totally isolated.
It is very disappointing. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the key things there is what is America's interest in all of this, and why do we not have somebody who's taking American ideas and preferences into their to shoulder ours, as opposed to, like you said, I mean, really, can you say anything less than he's a spokesman for Benjamin Netanyahu? So I guess if in the context of this discussion here in this episode, we're looking at when it comes to Trump, Netanyahu and Putin who's kind of got the upper hand. I think in the Middle East, it looks pretty clear it's going to remain Benjamin Netanyahu. I want to
Let me make a point, if I may. What is American interest in, or what should it be? It should be to preserve the state of Israel within its accepted borders. That is within the lines that existed in 1967 and before the occupation of the remaining small parts of Palestine that Israel had not already seized. The security of Israel ought to be an American concern, if only because so many of us in this country have ties to Israel. But also, as the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia said, peace between Israel and the Palestinians is the key to a broader peace in the region. And we have an interest in the stability, prosperity, and future of this region, because it is geopolitically extremely important. It's where Africa, Asia, and Europe meet. It's the center of the world's hydrocarbons. It is inhabited by creative people, both in Israel and the Arab lands, and we should want to have a normal, peaceful relationship with all of them. But it's going to be impossible if we embrace Israel to the extent that Mr. Huckabee and others of his like prefer. We will just be isolated.
Well, that's really the frustrating part, is that by going down this path to where we literally hand over the keys to American interest in policy in the Middle East to Israel specifically, exclusively, we actually facilitate the harming of Israel, both militarily and diplomatically, as I see it, in terms of the medium and long term. So this may have a near-term political advantage, but it's got a medium and long term. It's going to, I think, really harm them. And I'm afraid we're probably going to see that play out unless there's a change.
I think that's right. Conniving with the current Israeli fascist government is going to destroy Israel, not help it perpetuate itself. Israel was established as a refuge from Western anti-Semitism, not from Arab anti-Semitism. It was established to secure a place for the world's Jews if they wish to go there. Most Jews don't wish to go there. We have a very large Jewish population, which is American by temperament and conviction, and is not particularly happy when somebody who's 9,000 miles away claims to be the Jewish Pope and speak for all the world's Jews. When Netanyahu does that, and when Israel conflates anti-Zionism, opposition to disastrous Israeli policies, with anti-Semitism, it turns all the Jews into the world into human shields for genocide and its own barbarous policies. And that ignites anti-Semitism. And strangely enough, the history of Zionism, beginning with Herzl, is one in which anti-Semites have been regarded as the great allies of Israel, because they agitate the world's Jews and make them want to go to Israel, and they validate the Israeli thesis that Jewish nationalism is the key to safety for Jews. So we just saw a horrible incident in Amsterdam. The Western press has portrayed it as an outburst of anti-Semitism, but I think anybody who looks at the videos will see that it was a response by the Dutch public to really savage behavior by hooligans from the Tel Aviv football club who went there with Mossad, raising doubts in some people's minds about whether this was a Mossad demonstration to counter, for example, immigration from Israel, by showing that there's severe anti-Semitism in Europe. I don't know. But I do know that the net effect of what Israel is doing is not providing safety and acceptance for Jews or advancing Judaism as a religion. In fact, Zionism to me seems to be the negation of all of the very sound values that Judaism professes and has sought to advance throughout history. So this is a disaster, and we are part of it. And it looks like we're going to continue to be part of it.
Hard to come to any different conclusion. Let's shift gears a little bit and go into Europe and related to the Russia-Ukraine war. One of the first things that actually going back to 2023, then candidate Trump said, look, I want to end the war, and Russia-Ukraine will do so in a day, when he said this.
Before I even arrive at the Oval Office, I will have the disastrous war between Russia and Ukraine settled. It will be settled quickly. I will get the problem solved, and I will get it solved in rapid order, and it will take me no longer than one day. I know exactly what to say to each of them. I will have that war settled between Putin and Zelensky as president-elect before I take office on January 20th.
Okay, little hyperbole there, probably, but it takes two to tango, as they say. And interestingly enough, in terms of what the Russians are saying with Vladimir Putin, he says, hey, I'm willing to talk to him.
What he said about his desire to rebuild relations with Russia, to facilitate an end to the Ukrainian crisis, I think this deserves attention at the very least. And if he does what he has been promising, before the inauguration, if he makes a phone call, if he says, Vladimir, let's meet, I don't think it would be beneath me to call him myself.
Now, I've got a couple of things I want to explore in this aspect of it here. There's, on the one hand, Trump says he's willing to talk to anybody, and has shown he's willing to do that. But even domestically, and I'd like to look at that aspect of it first. Domestically, he's also being accused of being a Manchurian candidate type person. There's some commentary on the social media that he's actually has been for years a Russian asset, etc. So anything he does that moves in the direction of Putin and talks to him on any kind of a comprehensive level people are going to say, see, you're just a pro-Putin stooge. So how does he navigate that at home, first of all?
I hope we're over that nonsense. Talking to someone is necessary to tell them what you think. It's necessary to find out what they think. It's necessary, as Ronald Reagan showed at Reykjavik with Gorbachev, to solve problems. Ronald Reagan wasn't afraid to meet with the head of the Soviet Communist Party. I think he had some apprehensions, but he found that Gorbachev was someone he could do business with. I think there's no reason to believe that Mr. Putin is insincere when he says that he'd be willing to reciprocate a meeting with Mr. Trump. On the other hand, he hasn't called Mr. Trump. I think that's because, in fact, what's happening on the ground in Ukraine is going the Russian way, not the Ukrainian way. And he's looking to Mr. Trump to make the proposal that he apparently has, or says he has, to end the war. Russia didn't want this war, and it has paid a heavy price for it in terms of casualties, although Ukraine has paid a much higher price. And so I think Mr. Putin would like to end the war. And the conditions that he laid out for that have not changed. That is neutrality for Ukraine, as it was at the time of its independence, no joining NATO, which Ukraine agreed to in 2022 at Istanbul. Some kind of respect for ethnic and linguistic minorities in Ukraine, and finally, a broader discussion with the United States of a security system for Europe that doesn't threaten Europeans or Russians, that gives them both a sense of security. All of these things are on the table. They have been from the beginning. The one thing that has changed is that the four oblasts, Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia, that Russia has taken in whole or in part, are now under Russian protection, part of the Russian Federation. The question of whether they whether they somehow are put in limbo for a period before the people of those regions democratically decide where they want to end up, whether they want to continue to be part of Russia or rejoin Ukraine or become independent or whatever. That question, in my view, is going to be a central issue in any discussion with the Russians. And in my view, there are ways around this. That is to say, if you said, let's leave these so-called republics as independent or autonomous parts of the Russian Federation for a period of years, let's say 2 decades, 20 years. At the end of the 20 years, let's have a referendum there. If Ukraine has been able to persuade them to rejoin Ukraine, so be it. If they want to remain part of Russia, so be it. If they want to become independent and become a buffer states between Ukraine and Russia, so be it. I don't think anybody loses from this, and it applies democracy to the solution of a problem. I think it would be very hard to persuade the Russians of this because they own those places now, and they've paid a lot of blood and treasure to gain them. But I at least think it would be in Russia's interest to be magnanimous in what is a Russian victory in Ukraine and to leave open a path to friendly relations with the rest of Europe. So I think in terms of if we have a Secretary of State or an ambassador in Moscow or someone else who's an envoy who can talk to the Russians in terms of why it's in their interest to solve this problem that way, I don't rule out the possibility, difficult as it would be, that they might agree to it. In any event, they couldn't lose, because I think the chances are very poor that anyone in those regions is going to want to be part of Ukraine again. This whole thing began with a civil war.
Right.
If they decided to be independent, Russia would gain buffer states. What's wrong with that? And I think, finally, I'll just say, it's time to take out our copies of the Austrian State Treaty of 1955-56. That is the model for Ukraine. It basically neutralized Austria. It recognized it internationally. It provided great power guarantees of Austria's neutrality, and it required the Austrians to treat their minorities, Italians in the Tyrol, Slovenes, Hungarians, and others, with dignity, and allow them to communicate with their local government in their own language, and allow them to educate their children in their language. That is what the Ukrainian government, immediately after the coup that we sponsored in 2014, took away from its Hungarian, Romanian, and Russian populations. And that is actually a violation of the rules of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. So it is a violation of European human rights codes, in addition to being against the original Ukrainian constitution and subservient to ultranationalist elements in Western Ukraine. So I think the key to a solution should involve the restoration of the democratic will in Ukraine and in the areas that Russia has captured. I think there's no doubt that Russian speakers, for many reasons, have come to prefer to be part of Russia, but they should have a time to deliberate about that. And Ukraine should have time to try to entice them into wanting to be part of Ukraine. And if it can't do that, because it has not improved itself, dealt with its corruption, dealt with its absence of democracy, dealt with its oligarchy and its unfairness, dealt with all of the issues that beset it, then the loss of these territories is just something that Ukraine is going to have to accept.
And what do you think about the challenge? Well, gosh, I mean, you just got to start from square one to make that extraordinarily difficult diplomatic feat that you just described there with the Austrian treaty, to have some kind of a new reality. You've got to have a really good diplomat in the United States, as we just talked about. Doesn't seem like that's coming anytime soon. But even if you somehow manage to convinced Rubio that that's the path that would give the most success to the Trump administration and the people of Ukraine. What about the government of Ukraine? Because they have just categorically rejected any possibility of, even as recently as a couple of days ago, I saw talking about trading land for peace, etc. Can they be convinced or coerced into agreeing to such a deal?
I suspect that there are many Ukrainians who are not happy with that hard line because it results in the death of their sons, brothers, and sisters, or their children on the battlefield. Ukraine is running out of Ukrainians. And so I think Kyiv has just got to be realistic. And Mr. Trump's election will certainly help that, because it introduces terrible uncertainties for Kyiv. If I were a Ukrainian in Kyiv, I would be very apprehensive. And I note that the election has already had significant international effects, one of them bearing on the Ukraine issue, and that was the collapse of the German coalition government, where Mr. Schultz wanted to hedge against the possibility of a tariff and trade war with the United States, and also to hedge, to expand the economy and defense spending, to hedge against a possible American withdrawal of support for NATO of the sort that Mr. Trump has brooded about in the past. And that resulted in the collapse of his government. So I think, there's an issue there are people in Germany, many of them, who favor upping the ante with Russia, just like many people in the incoming Trump administration. That's Mike Waltz's position, I believe. That is to escalate, to de-escalate. I don't think there's any hope that will produce anything but a wider war. And that's why we haven't done it. But there is pressure to do it in Germany, and that is to release the Taurus missile to the Ukrainians for long-range strikes inside Russia. I think that will only evoke counterstrikes by the Russians, and maybe even counterstrikes on Germany, and a wider war. So that's not good. The second thing that happened, interestingly, was the United States got pushed out of any role at all in climate change discussions in Baku, Azerbaijan. That issue is now led by the Chinese. We just gave the Chinese the leadership of the problem of addressing the biggest problem our species faces, which is the fouling of our own nest with industrial wastes and hydrocarbon fumes and global warming. And on the contrary, the United States, the Trump administration, claims that it will be committed to greatly increasing hydrocarbon production and thereby increasing global warming, our contribution to it, and reversing the progress that's been made. And also by banning Chinese electric vehicles, as the Biden administration did, we have basically given the direction to our automakers that they don't have to do anything about climate change. And so they're going to stick with internal combustion engines while the rest of the world goes electric. So we're going to be, in the horse and buggy age when everybody else has a moving vehicle. This is not smart. So I think finally, I want to say, I hope I'm wrong about this, but the Lighthizer-Trump tariffs program and related economic issues seem to me very likely to rebound to our grave disadvantage. So tariffs are raised. If they are raised, as Mr. Trump promises, then immediately we get a big jump in inflation, because the price of goods at the retail level goes up. Price of other goods goes up because what we import is a lot of parts of completed products that we assemble here. Supply chains are disrupted even more than by COVID. The international currency movements this generates. Oh, by the way, we're seeing an interesting contrast between lessened inflation in the short term, although it's still pretty bad. I mean, people don't have money to pay the rent. It's doubled in the last 5 years. The average rent has doubled. That's one reason people voted for Mr. Trump. They wanted him to fix that. Inflation if you have anything left after paying the rent and the electric bill, you don't have much money for groceries, and groceries are through the roof. You know what the price of eggs is? It's 3 times what it was. So I think the tariffs will increase the inflation, raise the prices, but because people in the bond market don't believe that this will do any good for the United States in the long run, bond interest on bonds is going up, mortgage interest is not going down, the housing shortage is not going to get fixed. The dollar, if the interest rates go up the way they are, will increase in value, as it has begun to do. Other countries will just devalue their currency to compensate for the loss of the U.S. of their market in the U.S. to tariffs and confusion. And so there are knock-on effects from this. We have there's an expectation on Wall Street that there will be a huge increase in deficit spending, which will inflate the economy. That's great for the stock market. That's great for all the plutocrats. It isn't so good for everybody else.
Yeah.
And so finally, if, as I expect, there is a devaluation of the Chinese currency in response to these tariffs, that is, and the Southeast Asians feel obliged to follow them, that is going to tie Southeast Asia firmly into the Chinese economic orbit. We're not even part of the discussion there anymore.
Yeah, and I actually did want to expand the lens out a little bit to look at the potential impact of Trump and his senior advisors and his cabinet members on the both the U.S. China and the U.S. China Russia engagements here, and Putin also talked about that at Valdai, and I wanted you to comment on his views here.
You putting on a clip?
Yes, Gary, if you could roll that last clip.
China and Russia are cooperating and being friends, not against anyone. Our relationship with China is not aimed at any third party, the US included. Our relation with the People's Republic of China seek to develop and create a favorable environment for ensuring the security of both our nations and peoples. And the same applies to our relations with the United States of America. It would be very difficult for me to even imagine a situation when the president-elect makes such an offer as you mentioned. I think he understands that it is completely divorced from the realities in which we're living. Russia is not gonna ally with anyone against anyone.
But he is definitely going to increase his cooperation diplomatically and economically.
He is. I think there's a fundamental gap in perceptions here. The official line in the United States, the view of almost all of our political elite, is that there's some sort of evil conspiracy between Moscow, Beijing, Pyongyang, and Tehran to go after the United States. But I think if you look closely at what's happened, in fact, what's happened is that they're all in a defensive mode. That is to say, we have gone after them. We've gone after China, starting in the first Trump administration, big time, trying to halt its economic progress or even reverse it. And we obviously have a terrible relationship with Russia. And are even in a proxy war with it now in Ukraine, having pushed NATO to the Russian borders, in other words, our sphere of influence to the very borders of Russia. We have never been able to reconcile ourselves to the North Korean regime, which I think is the most dreadful regime on the planet. But still, it exists, and there is a danger of war in Korea. We have troops in South Korea in order to deter it. And finally, obviously, we're out to get Iran over our belief, which our intelligence agencies have heretofore denied, that Iran has an intention to build a nuclear weapon. Of course, Israel has nuclear weapons. So the wonder is why other countries in the region have not followed Israel in the clandestine development of a bomb. But in any event, I think he's correct. Russia is has courted China for its own reasons, its own national interests. China has turned to Russia for its own national interests, not against the United States. Pyongyang has turned to Moscow because it has nowhere else to go. And Tehran is the capital of a country which remarkably is significantly pro-American, but which we condemn because of our memories of the hostage crisis of 1980, which was a gross breach of international law and was humiliating to us. So, but I think, this is the classic security dilemma that political scientists describe. One side does something defensive, build up its forces, become more self-reliant. The other side sees this as preparations for an attack and responds with its own strengthening of its military and its own confrontation. And pretty soon you have an escalating cycle of confrontation, which ends in war. And that is where all this is heading if we don't handle it carefully. And I guess the final thing I'd note is we seem to have lost the nuclear allergy. And I don't think contemporary Americans have any idea what those of us who grew up in the early part of the nuclear age understood about the capacity of nuclear weapons to destroy our society, and more than that, to destroy our species and the whole planet. And we're now in an arms race with China, which was not an arms race with us before. That is, they had a minimal nuclear deterrent. We began to act as though we could take it out in a first strike. And as a result, they're doing a major nuclear buildup. If we get into a nuclear war with either China or Russia, we're toast. They are too, probably. Maybe everybody in the world is. And this is something we should be working to avoid, not escalating the pressure on the others to follow our nuclear modernization example, as we are.
Gary, do you have that sound bite from Hegseth we had the other day? Yeah, we're working on that. When you said that, that just reminded me of something I just saw a couple of days ago. I saw it a couple of days ago. I think it happened before that, where Hegseth was being interviewed, and there's a lot of clips that have been played from that recently. I think it was actually just from a week or so ago. He was specifically asked, "Are you worried about nuclear war?"
Are you concerned about nuclear war?
I mean, yes, in a general sense, I guess. I found overinflated from the beginning this idea that Vladimir Putin's attack on Ukraine was going to lead to nuclear war or war across the continent. I've always felt like it was, from the beginning, like a couple days in, I was like, this feels like a Putin's give me my shit back war. It kind of feels like, I feel like you've been pushing pretty hard, and we used to have the former Soviet Union, and we're pretty proud of that. And Ukraine was a part of it, and all these other countries. And I want my shit back. And I think I'm at the right time where I'm powerful enough to do it. And you're not quite on my border yet. And Biden's AWOL, so I'm going for it. And just like I did under my minor incursion under Obama, I got what I could. I got Crimea. Now I waited under Trump. Now I'm going to get my. And this idea that I hear all the time, and I've friends who would probably agree with us on most things. They're like, well, if you don't stop him in Ukraine, then he's going to go all the way to Poland. And he's going. I don't think he's. I mean, maybe in a perfect world where he had unlimited capabilities and he could crown himself king of Europe, he would. I think he's probably knows enough to know that it's probably not going much further than Ukraine.
I mean, we can talk about what.
Yeah, I think that would be interesting to dissect. I think he's right.
I wanted to focus on that first part there when he was asked about nuclear war. He's like, yeah, guys, kind of. I think that exactly illustrates your concern there. And this guy's going to be the minister or the Secretary of Defense.
Well, I think his mandate is to root out woke people and generals who have blow-dried hair and little military ability. So if he sticks with that, maybe it's okay. If he starts playing games with the Russians in the nuclear area, I think that could be disastrous. But, it isn't the Secretary of Defense who makes policy. The chain of command goes from the Joint Chiefs directly to the president, and the Secretary of Defense is a policy advisor, and he's also the manager of the biggest outfit in the world, the Defense Department. So the question for Mr. Hegseth is, what are your management credentials? What have you managed? Do you really understand defense procurement? What are you going to do about waste, fraud, and mismanagement in the Defense Department, or are you going to leave that to Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy? So one of the issues with all of the appointments is whether the talents and experience of the people being appointed, quite aside from their political views, the president's entitled to have strong support from his supporters. And if they agree with him, that's that. But what are their qualifications? Is the Secretary of State someone with strategic reasoning ability, management ability? Does he listen? Can he reduce policy to comprehensible terms that are still sufficiently complex to deal with an increasingly complicated world? Can the Secretary of Defense fix the Defense Department, which has failed every audit that it has attempted, and which now takes almost all of our discretionary spending, between the defense budget and the related budgets hidden away in other departments? We're at about the $1.5 trillion level in terms of spending on national security. And this at a time when we have to borrow every penny of that. And apparently we're looking to borrow more. So I think he's got a pretty important job if he gets it through the Senate confirmation process. And it isn't about so much about nuclear games with Russia as it is with fixing a pretty badly damaged defense establishment.
Right.
So
that's
the same thing is true of the other appointments. And I would say, my reaction to some of these appointments is, hey, when I was a kid, I worked in a gas station, so I should be Secretary of Energy. When I was a kid, I drove a taxi, so I should be Secretary of Transportation. Maybe I should try to do both at the same time. Anyway, okay. Let's be serious.
As long as you got the credentials, that's cool.
Are we competing effectively? Do the people we're bringing into power, because they are in powerful positions, they will be in powerful, influential positions, do they have the competence to hold their own against the competition abroad?
Right. That's
a pretty tough gang.
You start matching up qualifications of our minister or our defense secretary, Secretary of State, or some of these others against those they're going to be dealing with, both friends and foes. I think that's we're not coming out on top on that. But anyway, we'll have to just keep watching all of this. We don't even know if all these people will get confirmed. We'll have to wait and see how that works out, and we'll keep tracking this as it comes down. So, but first of all, thank you for coming on today, giving the so much rich clarity on a lot of these things, especially their context. Appreciate it.
Well, I hope I'm wrong about some of this, but I'm afraid I'm not. Anyway,
I share your view. I share your view. And we thank you guys for coming in and watching with us today. We always value you spending your time with us. We got another good show for you coming up this afternoon with Colonel Jacques Beau, one of our favorites, one of my favorites, because he's always got such a great insight to give on some of these things, especially from a European perspective. Can Trump end Ukraine war with diplomacy, or will Putin seize victory on the battlefield? Colonel Jacques is going to break that down for us this afternoon at 3 p.m. Look forward to seeing you there. And if you haven't already, like and subscribe on your way out, and we'll see you this afternoon on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.